The city bustled with life as the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting warm hues across the streets. Among the throng of purposeful passers-by was Elijah, a young boy with dirt-smudged cheeks and hopeful yet wary eyes. His outstretched hand trembled slightly as he whispered pleas for help, though he knew better than to expect much. The battered cardboard tucked under his arm served as his bed, a stark reminder of his reality. He stood at the corner, nearly invisible in the chaos of city life. His voice, hoarse from a day of begging, called out weakly, "Please, ma'am, just a few coins for food." A woman, shimmering in her expensive attire, turned to him. Rings adorned her fingers, glittering in the fading light. Her expression twisted into a sneer as she recoiled, snapping, "Don't touch me, you filthy child. My coat costs more than you'll ever see." Elijah's shoulders slumped, but he mustered courage. "Please, I'll work for it. I can clean, carry things, anything. I just need to eat." The woman laughed coldly, her voice rising as curious onlookers slowed to watch. "Work? Look at you. Dirty, pathetic, you're just a thief in waiting." Humiliation burned Elijah's face, but he stood firm. "You don't know me," he said quietly, his gaze steady despite the tears threatening to spill. The crowd murmured, phones discreetly capturing the scene. Before the tension could escalate, a deep, commanding voice broke through. "That's enough." All eyes turned to a tall, impeccably dressed man with a calm yet authoritative demeanor. His sharp suit and steady gaze silenced the woman, who stammered, "I was just teaching him a lesson." "Indeed," the man replied, his tone cutting. He approached Elijah, his expression softening. Reaching into his pocket, he handed the boy a crisp bill. Elijah stared at it, disbelief written on his face. "Thank you," he whispered. The man nodded, turning to the woman. "You've shown everyone here exactly who you are," he said, his words like a blade. Without another glance, he disappeared into the crowd. Elijah clutched the bill tightly that night, settling beneath a bridge. The man's kindness had lit a spark within him, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, his life could change. The next morning, Elijah wandered the streets, the bill still in his pocket, the aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from a bakery, tempting him to step inside. But before he could, a voice hissed, "Don't even think about it." He turned to see a girl his age, her torn coat hanging loosely over thin shoulders. Her wary eyes studied him. "You're new to this, huh?" "I just wanted to buy something," he said defensively. She scoffed. "Places like this call the cops on kids like us. Trust me." Reluctantly, Elijah followed her advice. She introduced herself as Maya and led him to a quieter part of town where a food cart served sandwiches without question. They shared a meal by a fountain, and Elijah asked, "Why'd you help me?" Maya shrugged. "Someone helped me once. Don't get used to it, though. Out here, trust gets you hurt." Her words lingered as she showed him hidden spots to rest and avoid trouble. For the first time in a long while, Elijah felt like he wasn't entirely alone. That evening, while waiting for Maya in the park, Elijah spotted a familiar figure. Simon, the man who had helped him. Simon's purposeful stride faltered when their eyes met, and Elijah hesitated, unsure whether to approach. Just then, he noticed Maya nearby, her hand slipping into her coat to reveal a glint of metal. "Maya, don't!" Elijah darted forward, grabbing her arm. She yanked away, glaring. "We could take his wallet and be set for days." "No," Elijah said firmly. "He's not like that. He helped me." Reluctantly, Maya backed down, her anger simmering. But when Elijah turned back, he found Simon watching them with a calm, inquisitive expression. "Are you all right?" Simon asked. Elijah nodded. "I'm sorry. She didn't mean any harm." Simon extended his hand. "I'm Simon. And you?" "Elijah." Simon's gaze softened. "I was hoping to see you again, Elijah. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Before Elijah could respond, a sleek car pulled up. A woman with sharp features and cold eyes rolled down the window. "Simon," she snapped, "are you done with your charity?" Simon's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "Yes, Amelia. I was just talking to a friend." Amelia's gaze flicked to Elijah, her disdain unmistakable. "Friend? You've stooped to this now?" "That's enough," Simon said, his tone firm. He turned to Elijah, his eyes apologetic. "Take care of yourself." As the car drove away, Elijah stood rooted, the weight of Amelia's glare heavy on him. Yet Simon's kindness lingered, a quiet reassurance that he wasn't invisible after all. Elijah spent the next few days lingering near the park where he had first seen Simon. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, another chance encounter perhaps, or some clue about the man who had been so kind to him. What lingered most in his mind wasn't Simon's generosity, but the tension in his expression when he faced Amelia. Elijah didn't understand what it meant, but he couldn't ignore it. One afternoon, Elijah spotted Simon again, sitting on a bench by a small pond. His shoulders were hunched, his usual polished demeanor replaced by something more vulnerable. Elijah hesitated, but then walked over, his steps cautious. "Simon," he said softly. Simon looked up, startled, but his expression quickly shifted to one of recognition. "Elijah, what brings you here?" Elijah shrugged, trying to appear casual. "I just wanted to thank you again. For everything." Simon smiled faintly. "You don't need to thank me, Elijah. How are you doing?" "I'm okay," Elijah replied, though he wasn't sure how true that was. After a pause, he added, "You don't look okay, though." Simon chuckled dryly, shaking his head. Sharp eyes. "It's been a difficult few weeks." Elijah hesitated, then sat down beside him. "Is it because of Amelia?" Simon froze for a moment, then let out a long sigh. "Partly." Elijah waited, sensing that Simon wasn't finished. Finally, Simon spoke again, his voice low and heavy. "Amelia and we've been married for 5 years. At first I thought she was everything I wanted. Ambitious, confident, driven. But over time, I started to see another side of her. Controlling, manipulative. She's involved in things I don't even fully understand, but I know they're dangerous." "Why don't you leave her?" Elijah asked, echoing the question he had asked before. Simon's face darkened. "It's not that simple. She's tied to everything I own, my business, my reputation. And lately, I've started to feel like she's watching me, monitoring everything I do." Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you think she'd hurt you?" Simon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out over the pond, his eyes distant. "I don't know, but I can't take that chance." Elijah leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Then let me help. I know how to stay hidden, how to watch people without being seen. I can find out what she's doing." Simon turned to him, startled. "Elijah, I can't ask you to do that. It's too dangerous." "You didn't ask," Elijah said firmly. "I'm offering." For a long moment, Simon studied him, a mix of gratitude and worry in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but promise me you'll be careful." Over the next few days, Elijah kept a close eye on Amelia. He shadowed her discreetly, careful to keep his distance. What he observed only deepened his unease. Amelia met with men in expensive suits, always in secluded corners of high-end cafes or private rooms of restaurants. She carried herself with an air of authority, her voice low but commanding. One evening, Elijah managed to slip close enough to overhear part of a conversation. "The transfer needs to happen by next week," Amelia was saying. "Simon doesn't suspect anything yet, but we can't afford any delays." Elijah's heart pounded. Transfer? Was she talking about Simon's assets? He ducked out of sight as Amelia ended the meeting and left the building. His mind raced as he replayed her words. He had to warn Simon. That night, Elijah found Simon at his office, poring over papers with a weary expression. When Elijah told him what he had overheard, Simon paled. "She's moving faster than I thought," he said, his voice tight with fear. "If she takes control of my assets, I'll have nothing." "Then we have to stop her," Elijah said. "We need proof of what she's doing." Simon hesitated, then nodded. "There's a safe in her office at the mansion. She keeps all her important documents there. If we could get to it." "I'll do it," Elijah said immediately. "No," Simon said firmly. "It's too dangerous. I won't let you put yourself at risk." "But you said it yourself," Elijah argued. "She's watching you. You can't go near that safe without her knowing." "But she won't suspect me." Simon stared at him, torn. Finally, he sighed. "All right, but we have to plan this carefully." The next evening, under the cover of darkness, Elijah and Simon approached the mansion. Simon had managed to disable the security cameras for a brief window of time, giving Elijah just enough time to slip inside. Elijah's heart pounded as he crept through the lavish halls, his footsteps silent on the marble floors. He found Amelia's office easily enough. It was exactly as Simon had described. The safe was hidden behind a large painting, secured with a digital lock. Elijah pulled out the small device Simon had given him, designed to override the lock's system. His hands trembled as he worked, every second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the lock clicked open. Inside the safe, Elijah found a stack of documents. He scanned them quickly, his eyes widening as he realized what they were. Bank statements, transfer forms, and contracts, all pointing to Amelia's plan to seize control of Simon's assets. Just as he stuffed the papers into his bag, he heard the sound of footsteps outside the office. Panic surged through him. He quickly closed the safe, replaced the painting, and slipped into the shadows just as the door opened. Amelia entered, her expression sharp and focused. She walked straight to the desk, her fingers tapping on her phone as she muttered to herself. Elijah held his breath, willing himself to stay still. After a few tense moments, Amelia left the room, and Elijah slipped out the way he had come. When Elijah handed Simon the documents later that night, Simon's face was a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You've done more for me than I could have ever asked," Simon said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Elijah shook his head. "You already did. You gave me hope when I needed it most." But as they pored over the documents, a new problem emerged. Many of the forms required additional evidence to be admissible in court. They needed witnesses, and they needed to act quickly before Amelia could cover her tracks. Simon made a decision. "We'll confront her tomorrow," he said. "With these documents and a few trusted allies, we can end this." Elijah nodded, his resolve unwavering. "I'll be there." The next evening, Simon and Elijah returned to the mansion, this time accompanied by a lawyer and 2 security officers Simon trusted. They waited in the grand living room as Amelia entered, her eyes narrowing when she saw Elijah. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice icy. Simon stepped forward, holding up the documents. "This is the end, Amelia. We know everything." Amelia's expression shifted from anger to calculation. "And what do you plan to do? None of this will hold up in court. And even if it did, who would believe the word of a street kid?" "I do," Simon said firmly. "And I have enough evidence to ensure you'll never get away with this." Amelia's mask cracked, her face contorting with fury. "You think you've won?" she spat. "You have no idea what you're up against." Suddenly, she lunged at Simon, her movements wild and desperate. Elijah stepped between them, his small frame defiant. Amelia froze, her eyes narrowing. "You don't scare me," Elijah said quietly. "Not anymore." Before Amelia could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police, called by Simon's lawyer, arrived moments later. As they led Amelia away, she glared at Elijah, her voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over." But for Elijah, it was over, at least this chapter of his life. As the door closed behind Amelia, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. In the days that followed, Simon worked to rebuild his life, and he made good on his promise to help Elijah. He enrolled the boy in school, found him a place to live, and introduced him to people who could guide him toward a brighter future. For the first time in years, Elijah dared to dream, and as he stood on the balcony of his new apartment, looking out over the city, he realized something important. He wasn't invisible anymore, and he never would be again. Elijah's newfound sense of purpose grew in the days that followed Amelia's arrest. But life had a way of presenting new challenges just as old ones began to fade. As Simon worked to restore his life and secure his freedom from Amelia's grasp, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unresolved. There were loose threads, whispers in the wind, of something larger at play. Simon's relief at Amelia's arrest was short-lived. While the legal proceedings against her began to unfold, strange occurrences started to plague his life. It began with anonymous threats, typed letters slipped under his office door. Then there were phone calls at odd hours, the lines silent except for the faint sound of breathing. Simon dismissed them at first, attributing them to remnants of Amelia's allies attempting to intimidate him. But as the incidents grew bolder, his car tires slashed, a fire alarm pulled at his office building during a critical meeting, he realized these weren't random acts of mischief. He shared his concerns with Elijah one evening as they sat in Simon's apartment. "Amelia's reach extends farther than I ever imagined," Simon admitted, his voice low. "These are her associates, trying to send a message. They don't want me digging deeper." Elijah frowned, his brow furrowing with determination. "Then maybe it's time we find out who they are." Simon looked at him, startled. "Elijah, you've done more than enough. This isn't your fight." Elijah shook his head. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. I'm not turning my back on you now." Elijah started his investigation the only way he knew how, by returning to the streets. He knew the city's shadows better than most, and understood that if anyone had information, it would be the people who operated in the margins. He began asking questions, careful to keep Simon's name out of it, framing his inquiries as idle curiosity about Amelia's known associates. It didn't take long for rumors to surface. A man named Victor was mentioned repeatedly, described as a fixer, someone who cleaned up messes for people with power and money. Victor, it seemed, had ties to Amelia. He was also known for being ruthless and unforgiving. One evening, Elijah followed a lead to a seedy bar tucked away in an alley on the outskirts of town. The place reeked of stale beer and desperation, the air thick with cigarette smoke. Elijah kept his head low as he slipped inside, scanning the room for Victor. A man at the bar matched the description he'd been given: broad shoulders, a scar running down his left cheek, and a cold, calculating stare. Elijah approached cautiously, his pulse quickening. "Victor?" The man turned slowly, his gaze settling on Elijah with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. "Who's asking?" "I need information," Elijah said, trying to keep his voice steady. "About Amelia." Victor's expression darkened, and he leaned back in his chair. "And why would I talk to you, kid?" Elijah thought quickly. "Because I know what she's planning. I know she's still pulling strings even from where she is." Victor studied him for a long moment before chuckling darkly. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't keep you alive in this game." Elijah didn't flinch. "Maybe not, but I've got something she doesn't. Someone willing to stand up to her." Victor's laughter faded and his expression grew serious. "All right, kid, I'll bite. What do you want to know?" Victor's revelations were chilling. Amelia had anticipated her arrest and had taken steps to ensure her influence remained intact. She had secured funds and offshore accounts and left behind detailed instructions for her associates, instructing them to dismantle Simon's life piece by piece. Victor, it seemed, had grown disillusioned with Amelia, seeing her as a liability rather than an ally. But he also warned Elijah that her network was vast and dangerous. "You're playing with fire," Victor said as Elijah stood to leave. "If you're not careful, you'll get burned." Elijah returned to Simon's apartment that night, his mind racing. He relayed everything Victor had told him, and Simon listened intently, his jaw tightening with every word. "He planned for this," Simon said, his voice laced with frustration. "She knew I'd fight back." Elijah nodded. "But now we know her playbook. We can stop her." Simon sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't just about me anymore. If her network is as dangerous as Victor says, we have to expose it, for everyone's sake." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Simon hired private investigators to trace Amelia's offshore accounts and uncover her associates. Elijah worked tirelessly to gather information from the streets, using his connections to piece together the puzzle. Together they built a case that went beyond Simon's personal grievances, revealing a web of corruption that spanned far wider than they had imagined. But as they delved deeper, the threats intensified. One night, Simon's apartment was broken into, and though nothing was stolen, it was clear the intruders were sending a message. Another time, Elijah was followed through the streets, the shadowy figure disappearing only when he ducked into a crowded cafe. Despite the danger, neither of them wavered. The breakthrough came when one of Simon's investigators managed to intercept an encrypted email detailing a meeting between Amelia's remaining allies. The meeting was set to take place at an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, a location as ominous as it was convenient for illicit dealings. Simon and Elijah decided to take a risk. They would attend the meeting, not to confront the conspirators, but to observe and gather evidence. Armed with recording devices and backup from Simon's security team, they prepared for what they knew could be a turning point, or a disaster. The warehouse was dimly lit, its cavernous interior filled with shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Simon and Elijah positioned themselves in a hidden corner, their ears straining to catch every word of the hushed conversations echoing through the space. The meeting was a stark reminder of how deeply entrenched Amelia's network was. The attendees discussed bribes, blackmail, and other schemes with chilling nonchalance. But the most shocking revelation came when one man mentioned a contingency plan, a way to discredit Simon entirely. Elijah felt his stomach drop as he realized the plan involved framing Simon for crimes he hadn't committed. The evidence was damning, and if they didn't act quickly, Simon's reputation would be destroyed. As the meeting ended, Simon and Elijah slipped out of the warehouse, their minds racing. They had the recordings, but they needed to act before the conspirators could put their plan into motion. Simon made a call to a trusted ally in law enforcement, and within hours, a raid was organized. The conspirators were caught off guard, their carefully laid plans unraveling as the police swarmed the warehouse. The recordings, combined with the other evidence Simon and Elijah had gathered, were enough to dismantle Amelia's network once and for all. In the aftermath, Simon stood on the steps of the courthouse, addressing a crowd of reporters. He spoke not of vengeance, but of justice, of the need to root out corruption and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Beside him, Elijah watched with quiet pride, knowing that their efforts had made a difference. For the first time in years, Simon felt free. And as he looked at Elijah, he realized he wasn't just free, he was hopeful. He was hopeful. He was hopeful. "Elijah," Simon said as the crowd began to disperse, "you've changed my life in ways I can't even put into words." Elijah smiled, the weight of his past finally lifting. "You changed mine first." Together, they walked away from the courthouse, ready to face whatever came next. For both of them, it was a new beginning, one they had earned through courage, determination, and an unbreakable bond. As Simon and Elijah left the courthouse steps behind, a sense of victory lingered in the air, but both knew that their fight wasn't entirely over. Even with Amelia's network dismantled, remnants of her influence could still pose threats. They had achieved a hard-won victory, yet the shadows of what they had uncovered weighed heavily on them. The following days were quieter, almost eerily so. Simon had taken a temporary leave from his business to focus on rebuilding his life and supporting Elijah's transition to a more stable existence. For Elijah, this newfound stability was unfamiliar territory. Living in a modest but comfortable apartment provided by Simon felt surreal. He was no longer fighting for survival on the streets, yet a part of him couldn't shake the unease that came with the quiet. One afternoon, as Elijah unpacked the few belongings he now owned, he came across the tattered piece of cardboard he'd once used as his bed. It was a stark reminder of how far he had come in such a short time. His thoughts drifted back to Maya, his streetwise friend, who had helped him navigate his toughest days. He hadn't seen her since the confrontation with Amelia, and guilt gnawed at him for not checking in sooner. Elijah decided to search for her. The search took him to familiar haunts, the park, the alleyways, and the hidden spots Maya had once shown him. He finally found her sitting on a bench near the fountain where they had shared sandwiches months ago. She looked thinner, her eyes tired but sharp as ever. When she spotted Elijah, a smirk played on her lips. "Well, look who's moved up in the world," she said, crossing her arms. Elijah chuckled nervously. "I've been meaning to find you. Things have been hectic." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Hectic? You mean playing house with your billionaire buddy?" "It's not like that," Elijah said, sitting beside her. "Simon's just helping me get on my feet." "Must be nice," she replied, her tone guarded. Elijah hesitated before asking, "How have you been?" Maya shrugged. "Same as always. Surviving." "You don't have to live like this, Maya. Simon could help you too." Maya laughed, though there was no humor in it. "I don't need charity. Besides, people like us don't just get handed new lives. You're the exception, not the rule. Elijah frowned. It doesn't have to be that way. You're smarter than half the people I've met in Simon's world. You deserve better. Maya looked at him, her expression softening slightly. Maybe. But better doesn't come easy. Despite her resistance, Elijah couldn't ignore Maya's plight. He brought the subject up with Simon that evening, explaining how much she had helped him during his time on the streets. She's tough, Simon, but she's not ungrateful. If we can show her there's a way out, I think she'll take it, Elijah said earnestly. Simon nodded thoughtfully. Let's invite her over. She might feel more comfortable if she sees what we're offering firsthand. Convincing Maya to visit wasn't easy, but Elijah managed to persuade her. When she arrived at Simon's apartment, she was visibly uncomfortable, her posture stiff as she glanced around the sleek, minimalist decor. This is a fancy. Simon greeted her warmly, offering her a seat and something to drink. Maya accepted reluctantly, her guard still up. Over the course of the evening, Simon and Elijah shared their vision of what her future could look like. Education, job training, and most importantly, a safe place to call home. Maya listened, her expression unreadable. When Simon offered to help her enroll in a community program for at-risk youth, she finally spoke. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Simon's response was simple. Because everyone deserves a chance. For the first time, Maya seemed to let her guard down. I'll think about it, she said quietly. While Maya mulled over her decision, Simon and Elijah returned to their routines. Simon began the process of reclaiming his business, focusing on repairing the damage Amelia's schemes had caused. Elijah, meanwhile, started attending classes, his days filled with books and lectures, a stark contrast to the chaos of his previous life. But the tranquility was short-lived. One evening, as Simon and Elijah were having dinner, Simon's phone buzzed with an alert. His expression darkened as he read the message. It's from one of the investigators, he said, his voice tense. There's been a breach in my company's database. Elijah leaned forward. What kind of breach? Sensitive files have been accessed. Files connected to the evidence we gathered against Amelia, Simon explained. Elijah's stomach sank. You think someone's trying to sabotage us? Simon nodded. It's possible. If those files are leaked or tampered with, it could undermine everything we've accomplished. The investigators' report revealed that the breach had been traced to an IP address linked to a property once owned by Amelia's family. Though the property had been abandoned for years, it seemed someone had recently begun using it again. Simon and Elijah decided to investigate. Under the cover of darkness, they arrived at the property, a sprawling estate hidden behind tall gates and overgrown foliage. The house itself was in disrepair, its windows shattered and its paint peeling, but the faint glow of light from one of the upper windows suggested someone was inside. They crept through the shadows, their footsteps muffled by the tall grass. As they approached the house, they heard voices, a heated argument that grew louder as they neared. You were supposed to handle this, a man's voice barked. I did everything I could, a woman replied sharply. But they were too fast. Elijah and Simon exchanged a glance. Whoever these people were, they seemed to be connected to the breach. Peering through a cracked window, they saw two figures, a man with a stocky build and a woman with piercing eyes. On the table between them was a laptop, its screen glowing with lines of code. Simon pulled out his phone and snapped a photo of the scene before retreating to a safe distance. We need to call the authorities, he whispered. But before he could dial, the woman's voice rang out. Who's there? Simon and Elijah froze, their hearts pounding. The man stepped outside, a flashlight in hand, its beam cutting through the darkness. Elijah held his breath as the light passed inches from where they were hiding. We need to move, Simon whispered. Elijah nodded, and they carefully began to retreat. But as they rounded the corner of the house, the flashlight beam caught them. Stop, the man shouted, charging toward them. Simon and Elijah ran, their footsteps echoing in the night. They reached the gate and slipped through just as the man reached it, his hand grasping at empty air. You won't get away with this, he yelled after them. Back at the apartment, Simon immediately sent the photos and details of the encounter to the investigator and the police. Within hours, a team was dispatched to the property, where they found evidence of the data breach and more documents implicating additional members of Amelia's network. The discovery marked a turning point. With the additional evidence, the authorities were able to dismantle the last remnants of Amelia's influence. The conspirators were arrested, and the files they had stolen were recovered before any damage could be done. As the dust settled, Simon and Elijah finally allowed themselves to relax. Over dinner one evening, Simon raised a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, smiling at Elijah. Elijah grinned. "To second chances." Even Maya, who had decided to enroll in the program Simon had suggested, joined them that evening. Though she still wore her guarded exterior, there was a spark of hope in her eyes, a spark Elijah recognized from his own journey. For the first time in years, all three of them could look toward the future with a sense of possibility. They had faced the darkness and come out stronger, bound not by blood, but by the unshakable bonds of trust, resilience, and hope. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The weeks that followed were filled with an unfamiliar sense of calm for Elijah, Simon, and Maya. With Amelia's network fully dismantled and her associates behind bars, the looming threats that had once shadowed their every step seemed to dissipate. However, as life settled into a quieter rhythm, new challenges and opportunities began to emerge. One morning, Simon received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the paper thick and expensive with no return address. As he opened it, his brow furrowed, and Elijah, seated at the kitchen counter, noticed his expression. "What is it?" Elijah asked. Simon handed him the letter. The message was brief. You may have won this battle, but wars are rarely over. Watch your back." Elijah felt a chill as he read the words. "Do you think it's from someone connected to Amelia?" "Possibly," Simon replied, his tone calm but serious. "Or it could be someone entirely new, trying to exploit the chaos left behind." Despite the ominous message, Simon refused to let fear dictate their next steps. He tightened security measures around his business and home, ensuring they were prepared for any potential threats. But instead of dwelling on the unknown, he focused on rebuilding his company and creating a more transparent, ethical environment, one that would be resilient against the kind of corruption Amelia had fostered. For Elijah, the letter was a reminder that even when battles seem won, the fight for a better life is ongoing. It fueled his determination to continue his education and explore ways to give back to the community that had shaped him, for better or worse. A few days later, Elijah had an idea. Sitting across from Simon at the dinner table, he said, "I've been thinking, what if we started something, like a program for kids on the streets, a place where they can get help, learn skills, and figure out how to build a future?" Simon's eyes lit up. "That's a brilliant idea. What would you call it?" Elijah thought for a moment, then smiled. "New Horizons." Simon nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "We could fund it through the company, partner with schools, organizations, and local businesses, give kids the resources they need to break the cycle." Maya, who had been listening quietly from the couch, chimed in. "It'll need more than money and partnerships. You'll need people who've lived it, who know what it's really like out there. Otherwise, it's just another charity run by people who don't get it." Elijah looked at her, surprised but impressed. "You'd help?" Maya shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Someone has to keep you in check." Over the next few months, New Horizons began to take shape. Simon used his connections to secure funding and partnerships, while Elijah and Maya worked on the ground, talking to kids in the community and designing programs that addressed their real needs. They created safe spaces for learning, counseling, and creative expression, focusing on empowerment and self-reliance. As the program grew, so did Elijah's confidence. He discovered a talent for mentoring, his own experiences serving as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope for the kids he worked with. Maya, too, found purpose in the program, her sharp instincts and no-nonsense attitude making her an invaluable leader. One evening, as the three of them stood outside the newly opened New Horizons Community Center, watching a group of kids laughing and playing in the courtyard, Simon turned to Elijah and Maya. "You've built something incredible here," he said, his voice filled with pride. "We built it," Elijah corrected, smiling, "together." Maya crossed her arms, pretending to look unimpressed, but the glimmer in her eyes betrayed her pride. "It's a start," she said, "but we've got a long way to go." Elisha nodded, his gaze fixed on the kids. "Yeah, but for the first time, it feels like we're on the right path." And as they stood there, the quiet hum of hope and possibility surrounding them, they knew that this was only the beginning. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. Now they were ready to shine a light for others to follow. Like what you saw? There's another video on screen you'll love. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.